Well, thank you very much, Father Larry. Would you mind, to begin with, give me a little bit of flavor on your early years,
Sure.
your family life?
Oh, yeah. Um, I'm a native San Diegan, and my dad was in the Marine Corps for 30 years. My mother's brother was in the Navy, graduated from Annapolis, first one in the family to go to college. They're all Irish immigrants. I'm the first generation American. I went to Catholic school from third grade on, mainly because they didn't have one until then. And I didn't do too well in public school. I was I got in a lot of trouble. And kids of my generation did. We were the World War II kids, born before the war, and our dads were away for 4 and 5 years. So a lot of us were, I think, we suffered in the absence of a strong male figure. So when the school was built after the war, my dad thought it was a good idea if I could go there because he thought the nuns would straighten me out. And actually, they did. They were a wonderful group of women. The class that I was in was rather unique because each year from third grade to eighth grade, the same sister moved with us. So she was our teacher the whole time, and she was the principal as well, and the superior of the convent. As a result of that, our class became very close. In fact, we get together regularly even now, many, many years later. So she gave me a very firm foundation in faith. However, and it's only from looking back, however, it was really an intellectual experience. In other words, I remember the old catechism definition that faith is the acceptance of teaching or of revealed truth as taught by the church. So it became an intellectual exercise, not totally divorced from experience, but separated to a great extent. I personally enjoyed uh, many experiential parts of my faith. For example, excuse me, I became an altar server in third grade, and I continued through grade school and high school. I loved to serve the 6:30 mass in the morning. There was something spooky about it that I loved, walking from my house to the church and back in the dark. I would often say the rosary walking along. So I think I was really strong in the prayer life, in the liturgical life, mass and all that, and in the understanding of my faith. I I love to read about it. I memorized all the catechism answers. I got great grades. Um, an old girlfriend of mine from high school looked me up a couple of years ago. Her husband had died. The two of them were in either the CIA or something like that in Washington. And I remember their wedding. I went to it with my mother. It was a great affair. But he died, and she comes out to San Diego periodically. And she said, let's get together for lunch. So we went to this great place down in Encinitas on the beach. And she brought this magnum opus that I did of 38 pages or something or more, proving the truth of the Catholic Church against her Presbyterian church. So I loved all that stuff. But again, it was mostly up here. Um, my dad was an active alcoholic until he died, never went into recovery, but he did stop the last couple of years because he was so sick. He was one of those that could do it. My drinking began in earnest when I was sent to Rome to study. I went to the University of San Diego as a seminarian, and then the bishop of the diocese sent me to Rome to study and be ordained the next 4 years. But over there, we had wine with lunch and supper. They called it dinner and supper. and I really developed a taste for it. So I began drinking daily at the age of 22. And it continued right up until I was 42 and went into treatment at the intervention of the bishop of the diocese. All of that time, I never had what you might call a faith crisis, because I kept my faith kind of distinct from the craziness of alcoholism, because faith was the intellectual acceptance of truth. However, when I got into treatment, I really had a tremendous crisis of faith, because I began reading and talking with the other priests. This was at Guest House in Lake Orion, Michigan. We had maybe 30 priests from all over the world there. In fact, now I'm one of the trustees of the place, and it's the old story of what goes around comes around. And I began to see faith because of AA and because of my reading and discussion, not in anti-intellectual terms, but in terms that prescinded from the intellect and moved into the experiential, especially the commitment to the higher power. So faith for me began to be no longer an intellectual exercise, but a real giving of myself to something greater than myself, what AA calls the higher power, what I would call easily God. So I began to adjust my Christianity to AA's understanding of faith and higher power. And that's where I am now, and where I've been these many years.
Right.
Yeah.
So you did seminary school at UCSD?
USD.
USD.
4 years, and after high school, and then 4 years in Rome. I lived at the North American College, which was a big residence and still is. They've got about 300 students from all over the United States. And then I attended the Jesuit university called the Gregorian, named after Pope Gregory XIII, who was a friend of St. Ignatius of Loyola, who was the founder of the Jesuits. So that was a great turning experience for me. And it just so happened that God provided the Second Vatican Council during my 4 years there. So it was nice of him to call the council while I was there, because I learned an awful lot, really from some of the greatest minds in the Catholic world, because all the bishops brought their prime theologians, and every afternoon there were speeches somewhere, workshops, and so it was just a constant barrage of new realities, new experiences, new thoughts for me. And I especially learned from the missionary bishops in the Third World to move beyond the intellectual to the heart. And yes. I love that.
I particularly connect with the, for me the spiritual experience is very much one where we move knowing into feeling.
Yeah.
From the head to the heart.
Right.
However that's, people like
right.
to say that. And again, that is, a lot of people discuss faith, but very much along the lines of a dogmatic
right.
Practice, which it sounds like early on
right.
the intellectual side was a dogmatic
very
practice. Much. But then a real feeling comes in.
Yeah.
It really is a spiritual experience,
because
it's like the whole world is on fire.
Exactly.
A lot of people are looking for a burning bush, but
right.
when the whole world is on fire, it's like,
right.
wow.
Well, and it's made me really keenly aware of and sensitive to people of religion who operate on this intellectual level and who try to impose it, according to my way of thinking, upon others, particularly through the political arena.
Right.
So I'm always cautious of them. I preach on this quite often. A lot of people don't get it, but I get it. And another thing that I'm sensitive to is the misuse of the term belief or faith. For example, the president asks us to believe in him. He says, believe me. No, that's not belief at all. That's accept what I say, whether there's any evidence or not, but it's not belief.
Right.
And because of our misuse of the terms belief and faith, we transfer that back to faith in God, and it becomes a very watery sort of thing, divorced from real life. For a keen example is I met when I used to be stationed in Arizona, and in my AA meeting there, I met a young Mormon. And so I liked him right away, and I said, how can you be an AA? You guys don't drink. And he said, well, I did. I said, oh, okay. So tell me about it. And he showed me the document of excommunication delivered by his church through his parents, and his parents shunned him. And now there's a debate on whether Mormons are true Christians. I don't care about that. But people of faith do weird things, like they may disagree with you and then throw you out into the darkness. And for anybody who has studied Scripture, as I have, knows that there's no model for that in the New Testament at all. The love that Jesus asks of us is unconditional. So and that's what AA teaches. So I really go after people in AA who say things like, well, I was raised with an angry God. I'll get him in the break. And I say, I want to know about that. Tell me about your angry God. And sometimes they've just made it up, but other times it's true. And so I said, well, listen, you stick with AA because we have a better God than that. So,
Right.
yeah.
You know, that experience is really one of a personal growth,
Yeah.
because God doesn't change, but our understanding does.
Right.
You know, and that is what is really required. But I I would like to go to that part, because it sounds to me like you have been very much involved in the church,
Yeah.
right from a young age.
Oh, I was.
And feel free if you.
No, I'm just going to turn it off.
And
I'm always on call, as you might imagine.
Well, in this job, I'm sure you would.
But they have to get used to waiting.
Right. But so the one of the things what I have found is that I think it is really easy to have a lot more peace in your life, and
Yeah.
there is and because of that, that peace may interpret into one's mind into being more spiritual.
Mm.
When we live in somewhat divorced from society,
Mm-hmm.
so a monk sitting on top of a mountain, it makes it much easier to have peace because they're not involved in society.
Right.
And the same with, maybe not dissimilar um, to your work as a father, even though you have a lot of people coming in with chaos.
Yeah.
It's not your own experience of that chaos.
Right.
And a lot
But a
of,
different chaos
yes,
that I can relate to their chaos.
yes,
Same with the monk on the mountain.
yes,
We had the experience this year in our community. We have about 30 Franciscans living here. We have our School of Theology downstairs, so we have a lot of students, and it's an international community. One of them was a monk from a hermitage for 1 year. He lived with us. And I learned a lot from him. He's a young guy. He's starting just in the beginning of his journey. But the interior struggles are very similar to somebody not in a hermitage. It's just not externally caused. It's internally.
yes.
Yeah.
Well, and this is, I tend to find that, like in AA, for instance, people look too much for the way that other people drank,
Right.
and to try and relate to that. And this is why we have newcomers, sticking with newcomers, because
Right.
they can relate to the chaos,
Yes.
and not look for and learn and find the real lessons in suffering itself.
Yeah.
So and really, I was made aware, and I truly believe this, that the one thing that connects all human beings is suffering.
Mm.
But a lot of people have to experience their own suffering
Mm-hmm.
before they can relate to somebody else's suffering.
Right.
Whereas there are a few wandering the earth that are able to already relate to other people's suffering and understand suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And typically you tend to find them in places, churches, monasteries. Um, and it doesn't matter how much they've suffered, it's that they are at that point able to relate to the suffering.
Right.
So,
And for the alcoholic, until recovery takes place, they don't care about other people's suffering in
right.
general.
Yes, yes.
And they learn to process their own externally and become compassionate.
Yeah, it's that explanation that it's a disease of disconnect.
Yeah.
Because we cannot connect to another person's suffering.
Right.
Whereas I think, from your upbringing, you have, I think, the teachings at seminary and at your school through the nuns will have been learning to connect with other people's suffering through the suffering of Jesus Christ.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so that may have changed or may have passed the need for you to suffer through some of the chaos that our generation currently goes through, or has been, like the typical alcoholic. But most people, everyone suffers. So even normies,
right,
like in the fellowship we like to call normies,
right,
they suffer. And the lack of faith, how I perceive it, is because they haven't been able to learn from their suffering.
Right, and they don't really have a program or steps or anything to do something with that suffering. Mm-hmm. They become kind of it's like quicksand, just keeps going down and down.
Right.
Yeah.
So I've kind of briefly explained to you, very briefly, how my view on the blind faith and experiential faith is. How do you feel on that?
See, I wouldn't use the term blind faith. That to me is something that's an aberration. Mm-hmm. Because I think the background of blind faith is you obey because I tell you.
Dogma.
Exactly.
Right.
But at least in the Catholic tradition, there's always been a desire to understand what goes into the makeup of faith. So that faith isn't blind obedience, it's commitment of self to a God who has revealed himself and a God who invites us to study in a very human way the relationship that we have with that God. It's like the big book that we don't tell a newcomer, just quit drinking. We say, no, here's a book to study, to learn how we live. Mm-hmm. And the same, that's what theology, I think, tries to do, is to help us to live the faith in a way that is intelligible. One of the early theologians, I think it was St. Anselm, or maybe even before him, he defined or described theology as fides quaerens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. So it's never blind faith.
Right.
Yeah. We wouldn't get this trust me line.
Right.
No, right. I won't. Give me some indication that you're worthy of trust.
Mm-hmm. and with my comments on how the difficulty for people that think they have faith, yet incapable of not wanting to control the outcome and in not truly trusting God, how does that understanding reconciling in you?
Well, see, there's within Christianity, from the 16th century Reformation, there's really different understandings of faith. The one that I think that you're kind of hinting at is really Calvinism. John Calvin talked about predestination. so that, for example, people would say, well, this gal has sold 1 million records and she is so blessed. Well, what about the poor sucker that didn't sell 1 million records? Is that person not blessed either?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it just those who have the material goods of the world? Exactly.
Mm.
So a lot of alcoholics talk this way in recovery about it is what it is, or um, it'll turn out exactly as God wants it, as though our will doesn't play a part in that. And I don't, the Catholic Church would never be comfortable with that, because that suppresses a big part of humanity, which is the will. And the will in faith says yes to God and asks God to lead us into an awareness, as AA does, of what is God's will, praying only for the knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry it out. Not waking up and saying, well, this is God's will today. Well, maybe it isn't. Maybe God would really like you to do something else. There's where discernment comes in, and that's the whole Jesuit tradition of St. Ignatius, the rules of discernment, he calls them. Yeah.
The wisdom to know the difference.
Exactly.
I think discernment
Exactly.
is very much
right on.
Right there. In a lot of discussions in our morning meetings, sometimes at some point, month 7, 8, people go into judging, start talking about judging and how we shouldn't be judging. But the fact is it's really moving from judging to discerning.
Right.
And really, having the wisdom to know the difference.
Yeah.
Because in the end, we have a desire, innate desire to feel safe.
Yeah.
And one of our strongest tools is to judge. But part of our problem is that we weren't judging very correctly.
Yeah.
With
flawed
with
judgment.
Full wisdom. Yes.
Right.
With lacking a perspective that allowed us a greater understanding of the whole, giving us a better ability to discern.
Yeah.
In
that famous scriptural verse, do not judge lest you be judged. A lot of people think that means don't judge at all, but it means really do not be judgmental, thinking that you are judge, jury, and executioner. Because I've often told a sponsee, you're not working a good program. That's my judgment, and it's true.
Yes.
I mean, I have evidence for it in case they need it.
Yes.
Yes. There was a big debate on this in Rome when I was a student, and one of the Jesuits, in talking about judgment as a part of our discernment faculty, he said, you enter a room and you see chairs turned over and the carpet on fire, and he described this absolutely chaotic mess. He says, you at least must judge something happened here.
Indeed.
So we cannot suspend all judgment.
It's, I think, more importantly, rather than to focus on, denying something that we do from a innate, deep self, that instead that this is, we can learn to be more open-minded,
right,
to be more wholesome in our perspective,
right,
which is limited. It's like right from the beginning, it's like our step one is it really, we can boil it down to, do you understand how limited you are? Your limitations.
Right.
And then when you finally admit that you have these limitations, that we can then move on to, well, let's see what we can what we can do with that.
Right.
And step 2 is like there is hope.
And discernment is a community exercise. No one can really discern on his or her own without other input.
Absolutely.
You really need the community, and that's been the constant tradition in Christianity, having a spiritual director or advisor.
Yes. Yes.
You just, because we can kid ourselves, and a sponsor now in AA,
We that morning group is a particularly hoity-toity group. We have
Oh,
some very intelligent people,
yeah,
and one on paper is one of the smartest people, a physicist,
yeah,
PhD coming out of the yin yang, but incapable of tying together time
yeah,
because he separates himself. That
right,
separation from others, the disconnect, because with that intelligence comes a close-mindedness that
yeah.
others aren't as intelligent, aren't
Well,
capable of helping.
yeah, you're better than,
Mm.
higher than, more special than.
Yes.
It's like the singer with the million records. God has really blessed me. Yeah, but what about.
Yes, yes. I mean, faith, and this is why faith is of such interest to me,
Yeah.
is because it is our solution to
Mm-hmm.
all of our problems. Yet we fail to go there as the first option. Instead, we have to suffer more. We have to try all these other things, and before we can move into like, okay, I am powerless.
Right.
I can't do this. What else is there? Oh, you know,
There's a
everything is
power
going to be
greater than
okay.
I.
Yes,
Yeah.
there is something.
We trivialize it somewhat in AA, though. I'm sure you've heard this too. Oh, choose the doorknob. What?
Right, right.
Oh,
Yes,
that's not faith. That's
yes.
nonsense.
Yeah. I mean, and that would be like blind faith.
Yeah,
And yes,
and stupid faith.
it is, and this is, I like how you called it an abomination,
Yeah,
because in many ways, it is, because blind faith also, in my view, makes us close-minded.
yeah.
It closes the
Oh,
door
yeah.
off,
Sure.
and the that closed-mindedness at that point, our perspective can't grow
Right.
anymore.
Well, Bill Wilson suggests that people might start out by a faith in the group, and I'm fine with that because I believe in group discernment, and in the Franciscan order we believe that the Spirit of God works through the order
Mm.
when we're coming to some kind of discernment about ministry.
Mm.
So, but not a doorknob.
Right, right. Yeah, it may have more intelligence than you do at
It
this
may,
moment,
yes,
but
and it requires a key.
right, yes, it requires a little bit of explanation.
That's right. That's right.
So, I'm also intrigued about how, because in many ways you've had a sheltered um, life. I mean, and with that, like I mentioned about the chaos that society can
Yeah.
bring. Having been in seminary, spent a lot of time in Rome, and then being within a community where you are constantly looking um, to grow into a higher understanding.
But that in itself is a source of great suffering
Yes.
for the alcoholic.
So how did you? Where was your source of suffering?
It was living a life that was not the one I should be living. When I was drinking, I was chaotic.
Right.
And I tried to get away from people as much as I could and be with people who were drinking like I was.
Right.
So you have that double standard.
The one of the daily reflections that comes up every year is the spiritus contra spiritum,
Mm,
alcohol versus the spirit.
right.
And in my view, it is very much, it causes an even greater disconnect.
It is, yeah.
How would you say were you, whilst you were studying and teaching, how did the disconnect most find itself inside of you, with maybe doubt, anxiety?
Certainly anxiety, not doubt. Although I'm a great advocate of doubt, I think doubt really helps purify what we think and believe.
questioning.
Yeah. Um, it was the overwhelming sense of failure and shame.
Right. Led through drinking?
Yeah.
Uh, was there anything before the drinking?
Mm. No, I started at 22 and
Right, right, right. And progressively got
for the
worse.
next 20 years. Oh, yeah.
So the the and in fact, one of the thoughts that I had is like when AA first started, uh, it appears that there were uh, three jobs uh, best or mostly represented Alcoholics Anonymous members.
Mm.
Men of the cloth, uh, doctors, and lawyers.
That's a good observation.
Whereas that has now vastly changed.
Oh, yeah.
And when AA first started, there were an awful lot of people,
Right.
men of the cloth, there, and and that has clearly moved away
Yeah.
from that.
There still are a lot of clergy.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, guest house where I went and where I'm a trustee, we get them all the time coming in for
So
treatment.
was that treatment or guest house, was that predominantly for the Catholic Church?
Exclusively.
Exclusively.
Yeah. We're thinking about opening it up to others, but we don't want to, let's see, the best way to explain. We don't want to downplay the importance of intervention and treatment for Catholic clergy.
Right.
If they figure they're going to an ecumenical experience, they might, I don't know. We have no evidence for this, but we just think it might not be as safe for them in their own minds.
I would agree.
Yeah.
I think there is because surely there would be where I'm looking to sort of do most of my research, be where you have people that have devoted themselves to faith,
Yeah.
yet finding themselves into the deepest disconnect
Yeah.
and crisis of faith
Right.
there is.
Right. Yeah. In fact, I know quite a few who have left the ministry in the course of their alcoholism for one reason or another. They got in a lot of trouble. They weren't able to be reassigned because of scandal, and so they just say, well, to hell with it, and they go out and do something else. I never got to that point. I'm not patting myself on the back. I just never got to that point. In my mind, I was near that point a lot of times. But the disconnect is a great word because that's exactly what is going on.
Mm-hmm.
Disconnect from your own self and from your vocation, your occupation. Same thing happens with any profession. I know lots of people in the medical fields and legal and law enforcement and teaching and everything else in the program, and I think they all would describe it. There's a young teacher in our group this morning who was talking about she's wondering should she continue as a teacher. Well, she's newly sober.
Annie?
Huh?
Would that be Annie?
No,
Okay.
no, another name.
Okay.
But she, so I sucked one of the girls over to talk to her. I said, go get her. Tell her not to make any big decisions right away,
Yes.
you know.
Yes. Yeah, especially in the first year.
Oh my God, the first month they want to.
Oh yeah, it's like, let's give up everything.
Yeah, but there's a real, the old time writers in spirituality talk about the battle within and the dark night of the soul and all that. And all that's true, because you're really battling yourself. And in my own case, I didn't understand what was going on. I've often spoken at our meetings and said that I had the stereotypical understanding and picture of an alcoholic, the guy even though my father, who was a highly functioning alcoholic, but I never put him in that category, you know. I think when it's around you, you don't realize it, and then you see it in others. So when they told me at guest house that I had a disease of alcoholism, I couldn't understand. What are you talking about? And then I was insane. What do you mean? You know, because we have all these ideas we're bringing in.
What insanity is.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Oh, they don't have it anymore, but over the threshold of the guest house drive, it's a big mansion belonged to the Scripps family in Michigan. And it said, "Welcome to Guest House Sanitarium." And I was offended. I went with a group of little delegates and myself went to the director and I said, "We don't like that sign." And he says, "Well, what?" And he was really patient with us. "Well, what is a sanitarium?" And he said, "Well, Father, you should know it. Sanitas is Latin for health." I said, "I understand that, but sanitarium is like nut house." And he said, "No, no, you, relax." And then we got to the steps in our studies and our lectures and our groups, restored him to sanity. Oh, okay. Well, I can live with that. But anyway, it's gone. I don't know
Yes.
when it went. After I came home, they took it off.
Oh, you must work on putting it back again.
No, no, we got a really nice sign now, except it says "Welcome to Guest House," and a lot of people driving by come in and think it's a hotel or something,
Right, right, right.
or a hospice or something.
People knocking on the doors.
Oh, yeah.
We'd like to make a reservation.
Big doors, huge oak doors. Yeah.
Where is that place?
Lake Orion, Michigan, about
Okay.
40 miles north of Detroit.
Uh-huh. Oh, that
Yeah.
sounds very
Oh, it's a
nice.
beautiful place.
Right, right.
Started by lay people, a man named Austin Ripley,
Mm.
who was a recovering alcoholic, and wanted to do something for the clergy. He said Catholic clergy weren't having much success in AA. This was about 1950, 51, something like that. So AA would be like 15 years old. So he went to Cardinal Mooney of Detroit Archdiocese and said, "Can you help us out?" And Mooney had this place that the Scripps family gave me. He said, "Here, it's yours, go for it."
Wonderful.
Yeah.
How are you doing for time?
I have to go in about 15 minutes.
Okay.
Is that okay with you?
Yes, of course. And
That'd be an
I
hour.
would like to come back at some point.
Oh, yeah, sure.
You mentioned something just now, and it was a very important, I think, understanding, but it's kind of left me. It will come back.
Sure.
I mean, we're definitely.
It'll be on
talking
here
about
when
it.
you listen.
Yes, it will. Have you? What I recently, a couple of years back, I came across the book "Forgotten God" by Francis Chan.
Yeah, I haven't read it. I've heard of it though.
And but what it did for me was gave me a deeper understanding of the Trinity, the Holy Trinity, and in particularly what he talks about is the Spirit, the
Right.
Holy Ghost,
Yeah.
and how it is the kind of the forgotten third leg of the Holy Trinity. Everyone focused on the Father and the Son.
Right.
And this is where we are missing our connection with self,
Yeah.
and the Holy Ghost really residing inside of ourselves, where we're a lot of people just aren't capable of recognizing and honoring the pure within ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that is one of the problems that we face as part of that disconnect? I mean, in fact,
That would be very specific. It might be true, but I think the main disconnect is within ourselves.
right.
The
But
self.
with that, not having that connection with the Holy Spirit within us.
That might be an explanation of it, but
Okay.
I don't think people would think of that right away.
Right.
The bigger disconnect I see, besides from ourselves and God and the world even, is the disconnect within ourselves of who we want to be and who we actually are. And we see ourselves on this path, and we keep thinking that we have the power to move back. And that's where alcoholism really has us in its grip,
Yes.
until somebody else helps us to understand that we're powerless.
Well, it's that the disease of perception. We have this one perception of self,
Yeah.
which we are fully doubtful over, because this is why shame and guilt comes into it,
Yeah.
because that brings a lot of fear and doubt into our lives. But I think and it was it's that disconnect of self, where we are in battle with our own selves and our own beliefs, and that is perpetuated through alcoholism, or normal people suffer this too.
Yes. Yeah.
How do you, when people come to you with a challenge of faith,
Right.
of their faith, how do you typically approach that with them?
The same way I do with alcoholics. We look on the disease of alcoholism as a symptom of something else.
Yes.
So when they come with a faith crisis, I view it as a symptom of something else. So I want to know what's really going on in there. So I prescind from the faith explanation or story that they give out. I'll come back to it, but in general, I really want to know what's going on in here in their soul.
Right.
And what challenges they're facing, and then see how that's expressing itself with the crisis of faith. Because what it means to me is that we're always blaming God. That's why we have the crisis in faith.
Yes.
And God let me down. I did that at Guest House. How come I ended up here? I was this dream candidate for Rome and all this stuff, and I ended up in the wilds of Michigan. I mean, what happened? God let me down. Actually, God gave me the biggest grace and gift I've ever had.
Yes, yes.
But I didn't know that.
Yes. 35 years of gifts. The gift of desperation.
Yes.
Whenever someone picks up a chip, I talk about the gift of desperation.
Yeah.
Let's not forget, we are celebrating the most desperate moment in our lives.
That's right.
And and we're celebrating, and we can celebrate it now because we have grown beyond that desperation through the suffering.
And we can laugh and rejoice.
It's an amazing
moment.
Yeah. So I was raised an atheist. I was raised in a very small village in Holland. I was adopted by Dutch parents. But my parents were outsiders of the village. They weren't born there. It was a little fishing village, but they moved there because it was an easy commute for my father. But he had a crisis of faith, and because of that, really embraced intellectualism more, science, and sort of seeked answers to life's problems through explaining what is going on.
Yeah.
And because of that, and of course, being a little person, we see everything through very immature glasses. But we were raised as atheists. Although there were only Christian schools there. So we were certainly, raised with a lot of Christian Bible reading lessons.
Dutch Reformed,
Dutch Reformed,
right.
Yes. And so I have a decent intellectual understanding of the Bible, which, as a good atheist, was very, very useful, because when I'm trying to prove to you that you were wrong, I could just pick up and point something to the Bible and say, what about this?
Right.
It's because there's, my view is that the Bible has three really important words, and then the rest of the Bible is trying to explain those three words in particular circumstances,
right?
And through roundabout ways. But, and it's coming back to God is love.
Yeah.
And one of the problems that we have in Alcoholics Anonymous, or people that are suffering, is that we have a misunderstanding what love is.
Yeah.
And that is one thing that I wanted to mention or talk about very briefly. Is I very recently came across the term via negativa, which I understand is a Catholic practice of learning to understand God better by understanding what God isn't.
That's right.
Would that be correct?
Exactly.
How do you practice that, or have you practiced that?
No.
Okay.
I really don't. In fact, that's a very Augustinian and Dominican kind of approach. The Franciscan approach begins with God is love.
Right.
And grows positively in that.
Right.
We really don't spend a lot of time with what God isn't.
Right.
However, now that you've raised the point, I find it easy for myself to point out to other people that the God of their understanding, based upon their lives,
Is limited.
is limited.
Right.
Really, let me give you a big example right now that's going on with us. Last week, Cardinal Joseph Tobin, who's the Cardinal Archbishop of Newark in New Jersey, had this big welcoming mass for gays and lesbians. Now, no bishop has done that in this country. Well, people are just going out of their minds. They're even sending him hate mail.
Oh.
Now, this is from good Christian people.
Right.
Now, their via negativa process has been, my God does not like gays and lesbians.
Right.
So if this cardinal, who's a big shot in the church, is bringing them in and saying, you're welcome and God loves you and I love you, he must be wrong and he's evil and we got to get rid of him.
Right.
So the via negativa is not a thing that Franciscan spirituality is very comfortable with because of the love of Francis of Assisi for all creatures and nature and everything else.
Right. So I think how I heard that to me would be the abomination of via negativa.
Yeah, right.
Because long before I learned the phrase via negativa, when I share in meetings, it is, when we get to step 2 and 3, I explain, it's like, first of all, I had to come to understanding that I am not capable of understanding God.
Well, otherwise you'd be God, wouldn't you?
Yes, I'm
Yeah.
too limited. I
Right.
have a brain that fits in 2 hands, weighs 3 pounds,
Yeah.
and with that I'm trying to understand the infinite.
It's all analogy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's impossible. So then I bring up the 3 words that really mean a lot.
God is love.
But that's the problem that we face in AA, is that we have decided what love looks like.
Yeah.
And so what I had to learn first is that love is not getting what I want, is not getting it when I want it, from whom, and where.
Yeah.
So, and in many ways, so when I heard the phrase via negativa and learned its meaning, that kind of made sense to me. Because,
Yeah, in that sense, yes.
Because rather than being able to explain what God is, because it's so all-encompassing and embracing, it was easier for me to grasp what it isn't. But
what love isn't.
Yes.
Yes.
But really, in simplistic terms, it isn't getting what, when, where, how you want it.
Yeah.
And from then on, realizing that, well, if that's the case, then I just need to be open-minded.
Yeah.
That love is far more than what I can fathom it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think I would like to set up another time.
Surely.
Because
I have my calendar.
That is wonderful. And thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome. I'm enjoying it myself.